Good morning, everyone. I'm on behalf of the Real Estate Board of Greater Vancouver. I'd like to thank you for joining us today. I'm Harriet Permit. I'm the Manager of Government Relations for the Real Estate Board. Welcome to the Vancouver Short-Term Rentals event. I'm your moderator for this session. We'd like to start with a big thank you to our sponsor, By Design Construction. By Design Construction is the second-generation real estate development and investment company. By Design has established itself as one of the top home builders in the Lower Mainland. Call Bobby for your custom home, laneway, duplex, or major residential or commercial renovation projects. Don't forget to ask about their referral program. Before we begin, there are a few things we need to go over. First, I'd like to mention the Real Estate Board's charity drive. This year, we're fundraising for our blanket drive charities that have been hit hard by COVID-19. They're not accepting our usual blanket and clothing donations for safety reasons, but we can still help by donating much needed funds. If you donate, you can earn special rewards like a unique social media badge, a Realtors Care face mask, and post-event shout out on our social media channels. To donate, go to blanketdrive.ca or facebook.com/blanketdrive. I also want to recommend to you an upcoming online session we're running on December 3rd entitled Professional Standards, Walking You Through the REBGV Complaints Process. Watch for an upcoming events notice from the board. And lastly, please hold your questions until the Q&A period at the end. Once the Q&A period has opened, you can type your questions in the Q&A section found in the panel at the bottom of your screen. We'll try to get to as many of your questions as possible before we finish at 11:30. That's it for announcements for now. So let's get started. We have a great lineup of panelists from the City of Vancouver's Development, Buildings, and Licensing Department that I'd like to introduce you to today. Catherine Holm is the Chief License Inspector and Director of Licensing and Community Standards. Matthew Young is the Policy Analyst. Claire Thompson is the Manager of Proactive Enforcement. And Koji Miyagi is the Deputy Chief License Inspector and Assistant Director. I'll now let Catherine get started with their presentation. Take it away.
Hi, good morning, everyone. I'll let Matthew load the slide. Thank you so much. Hi, and thank you again for joining us today. And thank you for the opportunity for us to join you today in this new virtual world of presentations. I joined you, a few of us joined you in February in person, and it's, we are all adjusting to this new format of presenting to you. I am acknowledging that I'm joining you today from my home, which is situated on the traditional territories of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh people. Next slide, please, Matthew. Thank you. As we were introduced by Harriet, but here's a chance for you to put a face to all of our names as well. As noted, I'm Catherine Holm, Chief License Inspector, and these are my esteemed colleagues that I work with closely and proudly every day on many projects, including the short-term rentals program. As introduced, Koji Miyagi, our Assistant Director of Community Standards and Deputy Chief License Inspector, is with us today and will help with answering some questions later. Claire Thompson is our Manager of Proactive Enforcement, and Matthew Young, our Lead Policy Analyst for the short-term rental program. So I'll provide a brief introduction and then pass it over to Claire and Matthew to lead you through the remainder of the presentation. And as noted, we'll all be available at the end to address questions following the presentation. Next slide, please. So hopefully you're all here today to learn about short-term rentals. That's what we're here to talk about. As you have probably gathered by now, short-term rentals are here to stay. They're not here only here in Vancouver, but around the world. And of course, the pandemic has shifted the use of short-term rentals and the demand as of late. But as we all know, we will come out of this and we will travel again, and the demand for short-term rentals will return and sustain. Cities around the world have been struggling to adapt to this new short-term rental economy. In many cities, especially hot tourist destinations like Vancouver, have introduced regulations to manage the short-term rental business activity in their city. That's what we're going to talk about a bit today. So we'll tell you about our short-term rental regulations and our program. And we launched 2 years ago in 2018, and we have been persistently implementing, learning as we go and adapting the program. And part of what we'll share today is some of the changes we've made to our program, specifically as they relate to property management. And one of the most important things we do in our role is to regularly communicate about our program to help various impacted parties understand what the regulations mean and to identify ways we can continue to work together and grow together. So today we are looking forward to starting our conversation with the real estate community again and identifying how we can continue to partner and dialogue. So again, thank you for joining us. And with that, I'll hand it off to Matthew.
Thank you, Catherine. So this slide just shows the agenda for today. So we'll start off with how short-term rentals intersect with the real estate industry. We will have a brief overview of the short-term rental regulations that were approved by Council in 2018. We'll talk about the new property manager business licenses. We'll give you a current state of the short-term rental market in Vancouver. And we will end with how we envision partnering with the real estate community. So the issue of short-term rentals is topical and germane to the work of interest of many real estate professionals. Many of the issues you see here, which are the dotted bubbles on the screen, intersect with multiple real estate professionals. For example, realtors may have clients who are first-time home buyers looking for short-term rental-friendly strata properties to live in while short-term renting during vacations or work sabbaticals. You may have investment buyers who are looking for investment properties to short-term rent, which is currently not permitted under the city's regulation. And finally, clients may be interested in knowing how our regulations intersect with the empty homes tax and the provincial speculation and vacancy tax. Strata managers may be interested in knowing how their bylaws are impacted by the city's regulations and vice versa. They're aware of the negative impacts of short-term rentals in terms of nuisance, noise, and general wear and tear in common areas, and how to enforce strata bylaws in terms of nuisance, but with respect to short-term rentals and report related non-compliance with city bylaws. Finally, rental property managers are concerned about the liabilities and damages that can result from allowing short-term rentals in their property, how they can mitigate those risks by either permitting or prohibiting short-term rentals in a tenancy agreement, and how to address non-complying tenants, which can include non-compliance with city bylaws. So before we start explaining the regulations, just have to clarify some terminology here. So a short-term rental, or abbreviated as STR, is a temporary accommodation in a residential dwelling unit for less than 30 days. A short-term rental unit refers to the specific dwelling unit that is used as a short-term rental. A short-term rental listing is the web page that is used to market the short-term rental. More commonly, it's hosted on a short-term rental platform website, for example, Airbnb and Vrbo. A short-term rental operator is the actual person carrying on the business of a short-term rental. A principal residence is the place you will call home, or as defined in the city's zoning and license bylaws, as the usual dwelling unit where a person lives and conducts their daily affairs. By its very definition, a person can only have one principal residence. A commercial short-term rental is a short-term rental that is conducted in a dwelling unit that is not a principal residence. So for example, an investment home, a vacation home, etc. And finally, a long-term rental is the rental of a dwelling unit for more than 30 days. So over the past few years, staff have done a tremendous amount of work to develop and successfully implement the city's short-term rental regulations. Since Council directed staff in 2016 to study the issue of short-term rentals and develop a regulatory framework, staff have consulted various community stakeholders, researched best practices throughout North America and Europe, and developed a balanced regulatory approach, which was approved by Council in 2018. So the 7 guiding principles you see here on the screen shows the city's careful balancing of the benefits and potential negative effects of short-term rentals. And these principles have guided our development and implementation of the regulations ever since. As many of you may be aware, the city continues to experience an acute rental housing crisis, with among the country's lowest rental vacancy rates and the highest rents. As such, protecting the city's vulnerable rental supply continues to be our primary focus, while at the same time allowing renters and homeowners to earn additional income to defray their housing expenses. The city is also committed to ensuring short-term rentals are conducted in a safe manner and do not pose a harm to residents, guests, and neighbors alike. We acknowledge that short-term rentals can have both a positive and negative impacts on the local communities, in that they can bring new business opportunities to neighborhoods in Vancouver that are not traditionally popular with tourists. But the increased visitor traffic can disturb the local peace and quiet of local residents if not conducted in a sustainable manner. Last but not least, we want to develop and implement regulations that are easy to comply with. So the city's short-term rental regulations is also part and parcel of a suite of housing measures under the city's 10-year Housing Vancouver strategy that is designed to address unsustainable housing demand and speculation. The city is concerned that higher economic returns from short-term renting when compared to long-term renting has led to the conversion and subsequent decline of the city's vulnerable long-term rental supply. Academic research conducted throughout North America and Europe shows that an unsustainable increase in long-term rentals cause increases in rents. As such, the city's regulations work in tandem with the empty homes tax and the provincial speculation and vacancy tax to ensure housing is used for its intended purpose, which is a home for people who want to live and work in our city. So before we talk about the actual regulations, we would like to hear from you on where you think short-term rentals are permitted. You'll be presented with some polling questions. So please answer yes if you think short-term rentals are allowed, and no if short-term rentals are not allowed. So I'll bring up the first question. All right, so the first question is, so Indira has just bought a downtown investment condo and wants to use the property as a full-time short-term rental unit on Airbnb. So yes, if she's allowed to do it, and no, she's not allowed to do it. Okay, so the 30 seconds is over, so I'll end the poll and I'll show the results. So a majority of you answered correctly. So yes, she bought a downtown investment condo, so she's not planning to live in that condo. Therefore, she's not allowed to use that condo as a short-term rental. So I will bring up the second polling question. So second question. So David rents out a townhouse to long-term tenants. His tenants have decided not to renew their lease. Can he short-term rent his townhouse full-time on booking.com once his tenants have moved out? So yes, if he can short-term rent, and no, he is not allowed to short-term rent the townhouse. Okay, the 30 seconds is up, so I'll end the poll and I'll show the results. So again, the majority of you have got that question correct. Yes, because so that townhouse was a long-term rental, so David wasn't living in that townhouse. So he wasn't the principal resident of that townhouse, so it's not permitted to short-term rent that space. And I'll bring up the last polling question. The last question is a bit more tricky. Okay, so Wong lives in a single family home with a secondary suite. Her parents, who live in Singapore, stay in the secondary suite whenever they visit Vancouver for the summer? Can she short-term rent her secondary suite on verbal during the other times of the year? So yes, she can short-term rent. No, she cannot short-term rent. Okay, the 30 seconds is up, and I'll show you the results. So a majority of you think that she can short-term rent the space. And this will become apparent later on. So a secondary suite and a laneway home is a separate dwelling unit. So Wong has to be living in the secondary suite in order to short-term rent the space. And I'll explain that in a short second. Okay, so that's the end of the polling, and I will talk about the regulations right now. So where are short-term rentals permitted in the city of Vancouver? So they are essentially permitted in a legal dwelling unit that is used as a home, also known as a principal residence unit. So note the nuance for single-family homes with secondary suites and or laneway homes, which was shown in the previous polling questions. And this will become apparent in the next diagram here. So the main home, the secondary suite, and the laneway home are each separate dwelling units, meaning if the owner lives in the main home, they are the principal residents of the main home and can only short-term rent the main home. If the secondary suite and or laneway house is rented out to long-term tenants, which is the second part here, then the long-term tenants can short-term rent the space, provided they have the approval of the homeowner. Now, the reason for this approach is because the city recognizes that secondary suites and laneway houses are a critical component of the city's long-term rental stock, often offering rents below the market average. So just returning to the previous slide. If the principal residence is stratified, so applicable strata bylaws must permit short-term rentals in order for the principal resident to short-term rent the space. Likewise, if the principal residence is a rental property, then the renter must obtain the permission from the landlord, which can be provided in a tenancy agreement. So where are short-term rentals not permitted in the city? So as mentioned previously, a secondary suite and or laneway house that is not used as a principal residence cannot be used as a short-term rental. And just to reiterate, if the homeowner is living in the main house, then the secondary suite and laneway house is not their principal residence. Short-term rentals are also not permitted in illegal dwelling units, which includes illegal basement suites and or laneway houses that were constructed without the applicable city permits, due to the safety hazards that they may pose to both the residents and the homeowners alike. They are not permitted in investment properties, so as I mentioned, vacation homes. If the strata units prohibit short-term rentals, then short-term rentals are likewise not permitted. And they are not permitted in rental units where the landlords have not provided permission for short-term renting. Now, this can also include purpose-built rentals with housing agreements or covenants on title, which restrict the use of the property to just long-term rental. An example of this is buildings constructed under the city's Rental 100 program. And last but not least, short-term rentals are not permitted in non-dwelling units, so motorhomes, tents, tree houses, garages, etc. So how does one go about operating a short-term rental? So first, the principal resident has to obtain a business license from the city. In order to encourage compliance, the city has created an entirely online application process whereby applicants are just required to attest that they meet eligibility requirements for operating a short-term rental and that they agree to comply with all the city's regulations. Licensing is likewise very affordable at an annual rate of just $99, which is prorated depending on the time of year the license was obtained. Note that because only a principal resident may operate a short-term rental, therefore no business, corporation, or society can obtain a license. Likewise, since a person can only have one principal residence, one home, they can only obtain one business license. Now, over the course of implementing the city's regulations, the city has noticed legitimate instances whereby a property manager has been retained by the principal resident to manage the short-term rentals. As such, the city has introduced new regulations in late 2019, which required these property managers to obtain a business license. So my colleague Claire will be expanding on the city's property manager business licenses shortly. So once a person has obtained a business license, how can they operate the short-term rental in a manner that is compliant with city bylaws? First, they must display the license number in all listings that are used to market the short-term rental. And this bylaw requirement was informed by best practices throughout North America. Likewise, a short-term rental can only accept one booking at a time. The operator must also comply with all fire safety regulations, for example, installing a smoke detector and fire extinguisher on every floor of the home that is used as a short-term rental. So please visit the city's website for more details. Last but not least, be a good neighbor by ensuring your short-term rental guests abide by all local noise and parking bylaws and dispose waste in a respectful and needful manner. So to that end, the city has created an online responsible short-term rental operator handbook, which is these booklets you see here on the screen. They're available in both English and traditional and simplified Chinese, and they provide guidelines and instructions on how to be a good and responsible short-term rental operator. So how does the city enforce its regulations? So the short-term rental market is incredibly dynamic, so bylaw enforcement is complex. As such, the city has put together a specialized team for online investigations and enforcement. It also works collaboratively with other city departments, including legal and property use inspectors. To assist with enforcement, the city has created a sophisticated tool that automatically scans various data sets, including the city's licensing data, community complaints from 311, data provided by Airbnb under a memorandum of understanding, and data collected from regular screen scrapes of all active STR platform sites in Vancouver to proactively identify potential infractions and generate case files for city staff to follow up on. Now, licensed and unlicensed operators are subject to different enforcement approaches. For instance, if a licensed operator is suspected of violating the conditions of their business license, they may be subject to audits and a subsequent suspension of their business licenses. The city also does random audits of licensed operators. For unlicensed operators and their property owners, the city will issue a legal order to comply and fines of $1,000. Further non-compliance can result in prosecution in a provincial court. So the city has a number of enforcement priorities, which by descending rank of importance are unsafe and commercial operators. So again, these are the operators that are not in a principal residence. The second priority is unlicensed operators who are attempting to skirt bylaws and regulations. So mostly the operators who have failed to obtain a business license. And third, nuisance operators. So these are the operators who are causing a negative impact on the community, for example, parking, garbage, and other related violations of the city. So this is the final slide before I turn it to Claire. So this table shows the city's enforcement actions on short-term rentals to date. And since December 2018, the city has publicly released enforcement actions on a monthly basis in the interest of transparency. These numbers are constantly changing because the short-term rental market is very dynamic. And now I'll turn it over to my colleague, Claire Thompson, who will be speaking about the city's property manager regulations.
Thank you, Matthew. I'm actually just going to pop off because I'm having some significant connection issues this morning, and I'm hoping I can remain clear and audible. So the video, turning off the video will help. So excuse me that I'm not going to be present there on video. But we are going to transition now from the short-term rental business license, as Matthew indicated, to an area of property management and discuss how they intersect. So over the course of the first 1.5 to 2 years of the enforcement program being implemented, we recognized that there were a number of operators that had indicated that they use other people to help them run their short-term rentals. This included managing the day-to-day operations, creating the listing, and communications online with their guests. It also became evident that people and larger companies had seen an opportunity in this, and they began to be a specialized role for marketing and managing other people's short-term rentals. So recognizing the need and wanting to acknowledge it and understand this line of business better, we also wanted to ensure that it was regulated within the Vancouver city limits. In January 2020, the license bylaw was updated to state that anyone managing more than one short-term rental on behalf of someone else is required to now have a license, the property management license specifically. So this means that if individual is just helping, say, their grandparent or doing it on a one-off, they're not required to have a license, but anyone else managing more than one short-term rental on behalf of someone else is required. So this is a newish area and there's some complexity to it. So we thought it would help to understand it a bit better by going through some scenarios. Next slide, please. So I'll just sort of walk through some scenarios here and help demonstrate when the property management and the short-term rental license is needed and when it may not be needed. So for scenario 1 here, Mary has opened an online business that specializes in assisting people to help manage their short-term rentals. She handles many aspects of the short-term rental, including the listing and bookings and checking in with the guests directly. So in this instance, Mary is required to obtain a property management business license. She does not need a short-term rental license. However, all of her clients do, in assuming that they all live in the area that they're short-term renting. So they're all required to have a short-term rental license, and Mary is required to have a property management license. So here in the second example, Ricardo is an Airbnb superhost who short-term rents his own property as well as manages the Airbnb listings of his Vancouver friends and families, and he earns a commission with this work. So in this instance, Ricardo needs both a short-term rental license and a property management license. His friends that he assists rent it with, they just require a short-term rental license in as much as that they also have to live in their home as well. In this last example, so Debbie is helping her grandparents who are short-term renting their home while they are on vacation. Debbie is the main point of contact with the guests. She's the one that greets them, does some cleaning, and sort of takes responsibility for the home while her grandparents are away. In this instance, Debbie is not required to obtain a property management license, as this is just a one-off scenario and just a very sort of temporary measure in place. Her grandparents, however, are required to obtain a short-term rental business license. In regards to these new regulations, we've continued to focus on education so that there is awareness of regulations and requirements for both the operators and the property managers. The property manager needs awareness to ensure that they take responsibility for themselves and are in compliance with all city bylaws, while also ensuring that the properties and the owner or renters that they are acting on behalf of are also in compliance. So under a license audit process, which could come from a complaint or from our own data-driven proactive approach, we would request documentation from the property manager, and it would all be done under the Chief Licensing Inspector's authority. The documentation requested may include the civic address of all the properties that they're managing, the URL listings of all the short-term rentals, and the calendar bookings of all these properties that they're overseeing. We also may request any additional information that may be considered relevant to ensure compliance with all city regulations. So the message here is overall, yes, it is okay for someone to help another operate their short-term rental. However, they need to be aware of all the licensing requirements here within the city of Vancouver. Next slide, please. So what does the short-term rental market look like in Vancouver currently? Well, as Catherine indicated earlier, it's obviously shifted over 2020 in ways that were unpredictable for everyone. It is an interesting time right now in this industry, and obviously one that is very dependent on tourism. So this is a pre and post regulation snapshot, and we've also included some COVID-19 indicators. And just to touch on the impacts of COVID-19 quickly, the obvious one is in regards to supply and demand. It's highly influenced by travel and all the public health restrictions and allowances right now within the individual communities. But it's also important to note that despite whatever is going on in the industry in response to COVID-19, that the city is continuing to enforce the current regulations around short-term rentals to ensure that they are all compliant and safe. So in regards to this graph, I just want to quickly review the definitions, as listings and units and licenses can be a bit confusing. So to review what Matthew said, there may be multiple listings associated to a property, as multiple rooms are advertised sometimes, and there can be multiple listings across different platforms that are used for marketing of the short-term rentals. A license is associated to a unit and the person that lives in that unit. So license is not specifically associated to a listing. However, each listing must contain a business license number. So with all that, the units and the listings were never assumed to be a 1-to-1 ratio, and therefore licenses and listings were never going to be a 1-to-1 ratio either. And so that's where there's some discrepancies in some where those lines end up. And hopefully I haven't confused you with those sort of definitions. So as you can see, prior to regulations, short-term rentals, we're seeing a continued year-over-year unregulated growth. In March 2018, Vancouver had over 6,600 illegal units on the market. We had no idea about the operators or details about any of the units. So since the regulations were enacted and full enforcement began, there has been a direct impact on the Vancouver market. We are now able to investigate and enforce to ensure that all these units comply with city bylaws, and we are also more easily able to identify the operators and units that are continuing to run illegal operations. We have an MOU with Airbnb, which I'll touch on again shortly, and you can see there in the line where there's a dip in September 2018, where Airbnb removed all listings that had not obtained a business license, which also had a significant impact on the listings there and compliance within the city bylaws. It's really important to note that the total number of short-term rentals on the market is not a negative or positive indicator of the program's success. Vancouver has a permissive policy and supports short-term rentals within the community as long as they follow regulations. So technically, every housing unit within the city with landlord and strata permissions, and that each individual lives in that unit, could actually have a short-term rental. So next slide, please. So as mentioned earlier, platforms are an integral part of the short-term rental as they broker the business transaction between operator and guests, and is where the marketing of these short-term rentals occurs. A key area of the program for us is to try and work collaboratively with the short-term rental platforms. Airbnb has continued to be the largest platform in the market with between 80 to 86% of the Vancouver market share, and this is year over year consistent. In 2018, the City of Vancouver signed an MOU with Airbnb in which they voluntarily shared data with us on a quarterly basis, and have also implemented a mandatory business license field in all their Vancouver listings. The MOU and the data sharing and willingness to voluntarily work with the city in regards to our regulations around business licenses has really been instrumental to the success of the program. We've also recently been selected as one of 10 cities globally to be a pilot with Airbnb, and we have access to their government design portal. So within this pilot and in this portal, it provides us with additional operator data as well as Vancouver-based information on the market and the industry. In regards to the other platforms, Expedia, VRBO, Booking.com, we have continuous ongoing engagements with them. However, there's no one else that has entered into a data sharing agreement currently, or have they implemented mandatory business license fields. Next slide, please. So back to why we're here today in front of you all and sharing this information. Next slide, please. As Matthew indicated, there are many areas of intersection amongst our work. The highlighted circle focuses on primary areas of overlap with the housing community, stakeholders, and specifically for short-term rentals. For the city, the primary goal for the short-term rental enforcement program remains to bring all operators into compliance. So through that, it's either they obtain a business license or they delist. In thinking about these circles and each of our roles, it's really thinking about where each of us has an opportunity to inform and impact the community that we live and work in, which is really important work to make sure that we're all living in a city that is thriving and building strong communities. Next slide, please. So in that intersection that has been highlighted, it is property managers and stratas are quite significant, which I imagine all of you are quite keenly aware of. Last year, we piloted work with Rancho and First Service, two big property management companies here in town, and we had a prohibited buildings list where strata bylaws explicitly prohibited short-term rentals. So a quick refresher, if an individual would like to do a short-term rental in a building that has a strata, they first off must be permitted within the building, and they must produce documentation if requested. And if they are a renter within that building, they must also have landlord permission. And so there's many buildings within the city that don't allow short-term rentals or in the processes of updating bylaws currently around short-term rentals. So with the pilot work, First Service and Rancho provided us a list of the buildings and projects that had very clear bylaws that prohibited short-term rentals, and they were flagged in our systems. So ultimately, if anyone applied for a short-term rental business license within those buildings, they were not issued one. This work with First Service and Rancho and moving forward really helped to support both property managers and stratas and the city to ensure that operators were in compliance. It was also really important to note that neighbors and the community within those buildings were also really positively impacted to not have illegal short-term rentals around them. We are currently expanding this work with the goal to incorporate all or as many buildings or projects that we can identify that have bylaws that prohibit short-term rentals here in Vancouver. And why this is important for you is obviously a key part of the industry is awareness for your clients and yourselves. Some of these buildings comprise a significant number of housing units within the city. It's just not limited to large buildings, so some of them are smaller projects as well. We have a very collaborative approach between the city and property management companies and stratas to ensure compliance and really encourage your clients to understand what they can and can't do within their homes or their potential new homes if they're just looking to buy. Next slide, please. So sort of going forward from the prohibited buildings is talking about overall compliance. Here is an example of information found on a realtor's website here in Vancouver listing Airbnb or short-term rental friendly buildings. Here, what we're asking is to really highlight the need to communicate openly and honestly with owners about what opportunities they do and do not have. If someone is purchasing an investment property within one of these buildings, then plain and simple, they cannot do short-term rentals. Even if it is a so-called Airbnb friendly building, if they do not plan to live in that unit, then short-term rentals is not an option for them. We talk to folks regularly who will say, my realtor advised us that I could do this, and by no means are we saying that it is correct for them to defer to others, but it is really important to give them correct information and encourage them to reach out to the city directly to understand what the regulations are. Misrepresented information in any type of advertisement like this can lead to direct non-compliance of the operators, ignorantly or intentionally, which are your clients. And this has a large impact on people, which it could be in regards to finances and their mortgage and their ability to pay. So we really ask that you understand what is and is not permitted. Next slide, please. And sort of following up on that is another example of a listing here in Vancouver, where the real estate listing specifically stated that the secondary suite and laneway house could be short-term rented and used as a mortgage helper. As Matthew explained earlier, this is incorrect information, and sort of hopefully moving forward from today, that'll become clear as to why that is not permitted at this stage here in Vancouver. Homeowners and potential homeowners really rely and trust on the information that you provide them as realtors. And as I don't need to tell any of you, this is generally the biggest purchase that one will make in their lifetime. And they certainly want to work with people that they can trust to share correct information with. So those units are essentially designated for long-term rentals within the city or for their own families or whatever they choose to do with them, but they're not to be dedicated to short-term renting. So, and I want to fully acknowledge that it is everyone's responsibility, homeowner or potential homeowner, to do their own homework and take responsibility for local knowledge. It's just really important that we all are sharing information that is accurate and not misrepresented. Short-term rental regulations are complex and they are evolving as the industry evolves too. and what is permitted in one jurisdiction just right next door to us in Richmond or in North Vancouver is not necessarily allowed here in Vancouver. So it's just really important that we know exactly what the regulations and bylaws are for each of the municipalities and the intricacies around them. So just to wrap it up on how we can all work together in ways we can say moving forward together. So realtors really are a main channel of information for property owners and people out there that are looking to buy homes here in Vancouver. So what we ask is that you provide accurate information to home buyers and new homeowners on the city's short-term rental and property manager regulations. If there's any questions about it, please feel free to reach out anytime. We're here at the city to help understand them better and provide as much information as we can. And we also want to ensure that realtors, yourselves as individual community members and representatives of your industry, are compliant with the city bylaws. This means both in advertisements of properties, as well as any of you that have short-term rentals yourselves or do property management on behalf of short-term rental operators. So from the city's perspective, we can provide more access to information, educational materials. We're here to help understand for yourselves as well as homeowners. We can provide information certainly about short-term rentals, as well as the housing strategy if there's any questions about that, and help direct people to understand the goals of the city. And we want to support your industry in regards to compliance as well. So we would look to be reporting non-compliant realtors as well to support your own industry. So ultimately, I believe both our goals are similar here. It's to have strong and vibrant communities here in Vancouver with a housing stock that meets the demands of those who work and live in the city of Vancouver. And together, I think all of us can do this by ensuring that community members are aware and in compliance with local regulations. And if there's any uncertainty at all, as I said, we're here to help. And there's lots of people at the city that we can help direct them to if there's something that we're not able to assist with directly. So with all that, I want to thank you all for your time and your attention today, and I'll pass it back to Harriet here to facilitate the question and answer period.
Okay, thank you so much, Claire. Really appreciate that. We thank all of you for presenting today. We have one more person who didn't present, that's Koji Miyagi, and he may also help answer some of your questions. Now we're starting to get questions coming in, and we have until 11:30, which is great. I'm actually going to start with one of my own that must be, rolling around in people's heads. You made one comment earlier in the presentation about the Real Estate Council. I just want to clarify, or have you guys clarify, that when you talk about a license, you're talking about a city business license for property management services. You spoke to the Real Estate Council, I assume, about what it means to be a property manager and have a property management license with the business council, the Real Estate Council. Is this something that is completely side by side, where if you need a property management license, business license with the city, that you also have to be a licensed property manager with the Real Estate Council? Did you have that conversation with them?
So we have not had that specific conversation with the Real Estate Council. They are not side by side, I would say. So the requirements of the Real Estate Council is independent of our requirements. But yes, it is the city business license that I'm specifically referring to here in regards to property managers. And it is independent of those requirements. This is specific in regards to operating a short-term rental if you're operating on behalf of other people.
Right. So the advice to realtors would be careful, check before you manage other people's properties, whether you actually need a separate license for that. And now most of our members know that, but it's good advice. You don't want to be offside with the Real Estate Council when you could have made yourself compliant with the Real Estate Council's rules, because that could jeopardize your other licenses. Okay, so we'll go to questions from the folks in the audience. Tammy says, the short-term and long-term rental bylaws seem to contradict each other. It seems that you can only STR if it's your own home. So if you have a basement suite, you can STR it, but not if it's a legal suite slash separate dwelling unit. But if it's not a legal suite, you can't long-term rent it because you are at risk of contravening the bylaws. Is that correct? I'm confused.
Sorry, could we get the question again? I think I didn't understand what the last part of the question was.
It's a long one. Okay. The short-term and long-term rental bylaws seem to contradict each other. It seems that you can only STR if it's your own home. If you have a basement suite, you can STR it, but not if it's a legal suite slash separate dwelling unit. But if it's not a legal suite, you can't long-term rent it because you are at risk of contravening the bylaws. Is that correct?
So, are you saying illegal or legal suite?
I know. It's
sorry. Is it?
I tried to be very careful when I said it. What she said was, if you have a basement suite and it's your own home, you can STR it, but not if it's a legal suite or a separate dwelling unit. I'm not sure about that. But if it's not a legal suite, you can't long-term rent it because you're at risk of contravening the bylaws.
So I'll answer the short-term rental part of it. And I'm hearing you say legal, as in legal, L-E-G-A-L, not illegal suite.
Not illegal.
Okay. In regards to the long-term, the secondary suite, if someone does not live there and it's in their basement, they cannot short-term rent it. They can long-term rent it, given that it is a legal, so it is a permitted suite, and they do require a separate license for that. So I'm not quite sure which bylaw. And Catherine, do you want to jump in? Is there something you wanted to add?
No, I think that's great. I think I think you, just to expand on what Claire was saying, the base, often there's basement space. Pardon me, I'm getting another call. There's basement space that's actually part of your principal unit, and principal residence, part of your home, and it's not a.
Catherine, we've lost your voice.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, you're back.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry about that. My apologies. So I'm not sure how much you heard, but if you have the basement that's part of your home and it's not a separate locked off legal suite, so if it's part of your home, that you can short-term rent that with a license because it's part of your principal residence. And that's what you're sharing with the guests that come to stay with you. I think it is important to note that if it is a separate dwelling unit, it does need to be legal. And by that, it's really, from our perspective, our interest is in it being safe, whether it's a long-term rental that you have in that space, and then that long-term renter you allow to short-term rent it. But either way, that space needs to be safe if it's a separate dwelling unit and somebody's living in it. I hope that helps. And again, let us know if we can add more context.
I think some folks you don't want to encourage people to have illegal suites and use them for short-term rentals because they're not caught by a regulatory system. That's your point, isn't it? Basically, you'd like them to be legal so they're safe, I assume.
Yeah, I mean, whether it's a long-term tenant, we ultimately, we're very interested in making sure that the properties that people are living in here in Vancouver are safe. We do have, obviously deaths and things like that happen every year due to fires and in spaces that are illegal suites. So, we do, through sort of a separate arm of our team, that Koji leads here, is our property use work to ensure that bylaws are complied with, and it's really, again, to protect folks.
Koji, did you have something to add that you want to add to that?
Well, yes, and it's just what Catherine, just expanding on what Catherine said in terms of maybe defining what's legal and what's the basements in a house may be illegally built, and so that could be deemed an illegal space if it wasn't developed with a permit. And so oftentimes we do get people that are listing basements, not separate dwelling units, but basements in their home. And it turns out that the basement was developed without a permit. So that is sort of a separate issue, but that is also a contravention to the short-term rental bylaw. And so there does need to be an understanding of when an individual is buying a house and they have a basement and they've been told to, yeah, you can short-term rent that if you like, because it's a basement that you can have a room that's rented in a short-term rental. We end up investigating that for whatever reason, and it turns out the basement was developed by a handyman, let's say, without a permit. Then we have to then request that that's, for safety reasons, be done in a legal manner. So we do get a number of those as well. It is a different scenario than having a legal dwelling unit, which is a different discussion that we had earlier. So I just wanted to point those pieces out as well, and it ties into what Catherine was saying about safety. And then I do have to excuse myself in about 5 minutes because I actually have to do a short-term rental audit at 11 o'clock. And so I do apologize for that. But anyway,
well, thanks for your input so far. That's great. Appreciate it. I have another question from Chris. What would be the most effective ways to get STR restrictions by area? So the other municipalities in the region. And I'll just say the board, my staff, we have a number of bylaw matrices that we do on other subjects, whether it's, secondary suites or contaminated sites or laneway homes or whatever. We do these great charts and we put the major features of the municipal bylaws across the region into this by municipality. And if it's interesting to people, then we could start a new one on short-term rentals, and maybe we'll do that. I assume this, we can run it by the city, make sure we've got the features correct, but that would probably be helpful if and there are always differences across the region. So hopefully that's helpful. Allie has a question. Is there any maximum time limit that a person can renew an STR license for the same unit? For instance, is a person if a person keeps renewing the license, say for several years, how would the city still be convinced that this is an STR under the umbrella of primary residence? And if you allow any licenses to go beyond several months, would you be indirectly encouraging people to just file false applications?
So the short-term rental license is it's annual. So right now we're about to start renewal for it in early December here, and they can renew it online every year. And assuming that people are still living in their principal residence and still living in the same home. If they have moved, then they would have to do a change of address application. So if anything changes in regards to it, and they're still allowed to do short-term rentals. If there's concerns that someone is falsifying information or that they are not in compliance with their bylaws, we would audit them. So hopefully that kind of helps answer Allie's question.
Okay.
It's a self-declaration process in the online application. So if we receive any information or have any considerations around it through our own approach that things have shifted, and we obviously have the Airbnb data as well, then we would proactively do an audit to ensure that all the information that they provided in their license is still in compliance with our bylaws.
Okay. And that's an annual process based on a calendar year, not the annual application date, but the same time every year.
Yeah, so it expires December 31st every year.
Okay.
And then by January 1st, they have to have a new license. And that must be, the new license number must be updated in all their listings as well. So it's not, if they have Airbnb and VRBO, they have to update their new license number with the next year, early 2021, in a different sort of 6 digits that follow. So it must be updated.
Okay, that's great. Emma asks, STR applies to an unauthorized suite then, but will that be contradicting with this, where did it go? Somebody just touched my screen here. Sorry about that. STR applies to unauthorized suites. Is that correct? Would that be contradicting what the city wants to do with with legal suites. That makes sense. You can't STR an unauthorized suite. Is that correct?
No, it has to be a legal dwelling unit. That's one of the requirements of the license, and it has to be safe as well.
Okay, so there's no contradictions there. Okay. Rajiv, I'm using my secondary suite for my office use, and I also live in the suite. How many licenses do I need to get an STR? Okay.
He's only allowed to get one short-term rental license. So the one that he lives, if he uses where he said wherever he's living, so that address, he's only allowed to have one short-term rental license for his primary residence. So if it's different areas being used for office, you can't have one for an office and one for your primary residence. It's the address which is associated to your bills and where you really are residing. And then if there's a property management side of it, that would be sort of different. So I'm not sure if I understand the question enough, but hopefully that helps.
I'm just curious, if someone's using the space currently as an office rather than actually living in it, that doesn't make it eligible for an STR. If they got an office.
That's right. You have to be living there.
Okay.
So if you use it as an office, then you're not living there. And if it is a legal dwelling unit that he chooses to use as an office and not rent it out as a long-term rental, then that space is not eligible to be a short-term rental. And so if he's using it as an office and he lives upstairs as his primary residence, then he can only get a license for the upstairs. The downstairs that he uses as an office is not eligible to be a short-term rental.
Okay, unless he does both and lives in the office area as well. If it's big enough, then he gets out for a little while but comes back.
Yeah, if he lives in the office space, I guess, and has a fridge and a stove and a bathroom, and because it's a legal dwelling unit and he can prove that he lives there, then short-term rental could be, would be considered. The question of what happens to the upstairs, then he would have to forego living upstairs, and that would have to be taken out from his name and so on and so forth.
Okay, Shelley wants to know, if someone wants to buy a home to run a B&B in their basement, what can they buy? Does it have to be a home that was not ever rented? Also, if someone buys a home with a rental suite, if they don't rent it out, are they subject to the empty homes tax?
So for a bed and breakfast, it's a completely separate license with different requirements. So I would encourage the people to look online to see what the requirements are. It is very specific and is different than the short-term rental one. And then in regards to does it have to be a home that was never rented? Yeah, so I would encourage them to look and see what the requirements are for a bed and breakfast. In regards to empty homes, if they don't rent it out, are they subject to an empty homes tax? So empty homes tax speaks of a parcel. The short-term rental, when we're talking about licenses, as Matthew indicated earlier, if there's on a parcel, you may have the main house, a secondary suite, and a laneway house. Those are all three separate units, living units, and may have and likely have different addresses. Empty homes tax has different considerations, and they're referencing a parcel of land rather than all the units on it. So there are differences between the programs, and it's just important that they understand them. We can certainly help provide information on that because those are some interesting little nuances as well.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Charlie. Can a portion of a principal residence be an STR if it is not a suite? It has a separate entry and bathroom, but no stove, for example.
Yeah, and I think Catherine touched on this earlier. If there's sort of like a lock-off unit, so some people, if they have separate areas in their basement that has an independent bathroom and another suite, it may even have sort of an access area. That could be a short-term rental down there. But if it has any sort of kitchen fixtures and things like that, it would it would really be dependent on whether it's considered legal or not. But absolutely, if there is a sort of a lock-off unit and it's all considered safe and legal, then that could be a short-term rental, assuming that it's associated to the main property as well, sort of the main residence.
Okay. Kelly would like to know, what is the reason that investors are prevented from operating an STR?
So if you think about sort of where Matthew talked about our guiding principles in the development of the short-term rental program and the regulations around it, it really is around, there's sort of 7 different guiding principles, and sort of balancing them out is tough because some of them sort of are they play off each other in different ways. But really the primary focus is to support the long-term market within Vancouver. And an investment property with no one living in it should be on the long-term rental market and should not be a short-term rental. We have a vacancy rate that just hovers around 1%. So until it gets to a healthier level, we have committed to looking at it, which is considered 3 to 4%. We considered what that would look like, but right now we're far from that. So it really is to protect and preserve the long-term rental market and make sure that everyone here in Vancouver has a place to live.
Right. So you're encouraging them to go to long-term rental for the investors rather than short-term rentals.
Yeah, that's all they're allowed to do. Yeah.
That's the point. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Robin says, does a tenant require a written agreement from the landlord before applying for an STR license? Does the city require a copy of that agreement?
So it's a self-declaration online, and it in the self-declaration, it will say, do you have landlord permission if you're a renter? So they would say yes in the online application process. We don't require it to administer the license, so it's auto-issued after they've done their self-declaration. However, if in an audit process, we will require that documentation to actually have evidence that the landlord does support that they can do short-term rentals within that unit.
Okay.
So it's not required to get the license, but at any point in time, we may request it from the people, and they do have to produce it for us.
Yeah. So it would catch up with them eventually, maybe. Okay. Tammy asks, instead of creating a list of strata properties that prohibit STRs, why wouldn't you also create a list of strata properties that allow for STR? Is that a consideration?
So, I mean, strata bylaws are complex. We don't go into interpreting them ourselves. And right now we're focused on ones, the ones that we're looking for, it is to make sure that they're not getting license issued to them. So that's in regards to the prohibited buildings list. It is to make sure that these people who are living in these buildings and may apply for a license, either knowingly or unknowingly, that they're allowed in the building, are not issued a license, because that is against the bylaws. Right now, it really is up to the owners of the properties or yourselves to know what is permitted or not within those buildings and the strata units. As I said, the strata bylaws, they're evolving and they constantly change as well. So right now, we're really focusing on the ones that explicitly prohibit short-term rentals so that we can make sure that those ones aren't licensed and are in compliance with our bylaws.
Right. Your earlier slide said that a strata, if they are prohibiting STRs, they need to tell you. So you need a letter or something from the strata, maybe the strata manager, to tell you that they want to be on that buildings list.
Yeah, so they provide all the addresses to us and all the units associated with that building, as well as it's explicitly state that they're prohibited within that project or building.
Okay. Okay. They need to tell you. You can't possibly know every building that prohibits.
No, and since the bylaws obviously can change over time as well, type thing. So it really is on the onus of these property managers to let us know if something has changed from their bylaws, either to allow them or prohibit them. And as I said, when people sort of give us bylaws to say it is allowed or not allowed, we don't interpret them, because bylaws are so complex, and somewhere else down the way they may say something that's a bit different. So it really is this specific documentation that states that they're not permitted.
Okay. Not every building has a property manager. They could be self-managed. I wonder how many strata councils know this, because it would be on them to do it if that's the case. It may not be a big building, but they could have the same rules. So especially if they're small, they may well have that rule. Anyway, okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, so Stephen is asking, he's just trying to clarify what he considers confusion. He said you meant, now this is possibly my fault. You mentioned licensed property manager and then licensed STR property manager. Is that correct? What's the difference? Do a property manager who's licensed under the Real Estate Council, just doing long-term property management, not STRs, do they need to obtain a license from the City of Vancouver? Business license.
So we do probably, Matthew, I think you probably are able to answer this more efficiently than I am.
Yes. So I can clarify the definition of a property manager under the city's license bylaw. So it's either you are a property manager that has been licensed by the Real Estate Council to do long-term rentals, and or a property manager who is just doing short-term rentals. So in either case, you need to acquire a city business license. Obviously, if you're just doing short-term rentals, you don't need to acquire the Real Estate Council's property manager business license, but you still need to acquire the city's property manager business license. Does that make it clear?
Start, yeah, it's good.
It's a complex area.
Yeah. Well, we'll check into that as well, just to make sure. We'll have a chat with the Real Estate Council about how their rules work, and are they aware that this is being somehow tied to the term property management? It's important that they know this. We'll chat with them. So Tammy is asking, how do you define principal residence and what are the criteria?
Well, it's where you live, sort of. We'll start with that. And I know that people travel a lot, and we talk about where you conduct your daily affairs and have all your sort of mail sent. But there is, there's documentation that can support it, but really it is where you live. And so if people are looking to get around it, sort of a bit hesitant to share what our criteria is, but there's some documentation, but then there's conversations we have as well. We truly try and obviously understand that there's students and travel and different living situations for people, but so the quick and short of it, it's truly where you live in one specific unit.
Does that follow what the federal government considers a principal residence for tax purposes? Did you look at that definition? Because it's what you're saying, but there is an existing definition legally under what a principal residence is.
In regards to the federal one, I'm not as familiar just off the top of my head on it, but it certainly was they were all looked at, and the speculation tax from the province and the empty homes tax within the city as well. We all have little different nuances about what it means in regards to vacation homes and principal residence, and they may require different documentation to support that. So how empty homes tax comes about, their determination we do have some alignment, but there are differences as well, because ultimately the outcome is different as well. So yeah.
Okay, so the advice to people is, don't assume you know what it means. Look at the rules and the materials that you people are providing and read that. If they're dealing with this particular issue, don't assume you know what it means because it says something somewhere else.
Yes, yeah.
That would be my advice. Okay, it may have different points to it. Okay, now Dylan asks, if someone Airbnbs their condo while they're on holiday or out of town, is there a limit to the number of days they can rent on STR if the strata doesn't restrict it?
So as long as they live in that unit when they're home, there's no restriction. If you're traveling for 6 days, 6 weeks, or you're off on a bigger adventure of 6 months, you could technically short-term rent it for that time you're away. If you go on sabbatical for 2 years and are considered away, then that's no longer considered your principal residence at the time that you're actually traveling. You've sort of established a home in another area. So you wouldn't be able to have a short-term rental at that point in time. But ultimately, if it's these smaller trips and you do really live there throughout the year, then there's really no limit at this stage in regards to how many days it can be short-term rented.
Okay, I have a question from Robin. Is a license transferable to a new owner if they're going to occupy the home as well as retaining the existing STR?
Actually, is a license transferable to an owner?
Yeah. If they're going to live in the home.
No, the new owner would have to apply themselves for their own independent short-term rental license. If someone switches addresses themselves, so if I have a short-term rental license and then I move down the street and I'm allowed to do it at the new unit, or I own it, then I would have to do a change of address form. But if it's a brand new person doing it, then they have to go through the whole application process themselves. There's no transferring.
Okay. Can you STR one of your main residence bedrooms while living in the house? This is Anka.
Yes. And you can do that every day of the year if you'd like, as long as you're living in the main house and you are comfortable with people. Absolutely, that's what we encourage. And that's certainly the foundation of the program.
I was thinking that's the origins of the original
Yeah.
program in the States. So somebody had an extra bedroom or their living room couch or something like that. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, Ting Yu asks, what about listings in Airbnbs that only accept guests with more than 30 days reservation? Is it considered an STR, or can the landlord operate with long-term rental licenses?
Anything greater than 30 days is not considered an STR. And they do require the long-term rental license. So that's correct. But yeah, it's no longer considered a short-term rental if it's more than 30 days.
Okay. Dawn asks, if a client buys a house, how long does he have to live in the house before he can start an STR? How often does he have to go back in between rentals? I assume you don't have to live with your renters.
So there's no minimum amount of time that someone has to live in a unit. However, we do require documentation. Sometimes we'll audit the people and they need to have documentation that supports that they live there as a principal resident. So we obviously do understand circumstances as well where people have just moved in, but that's a consideration. So the primary ID as well as supporting documentation, and that may take a bit of time for people to get. How often does he have to go back in between rentals? I'm not sure I understand the question. And if anyone else does, maybe jump in.
I wonder if it has to do with getting a new license.
Okay.
In the 1 year period, you don't need a new license if you have a different person in the unit, right? The license is yours as the owner.
Yes, as the principal resident of that unit, the license is yours, and it's not dependent on how many short-term rentals do come and go or anything.
Okay, so Sylvia asks, to clarify, if you have a legal secondary suite that you generally occupy yourself in addition to the main part of your home, can you legally short-term rent the suite on occasion?
The way I read the question is that the individual saying that they have a legal secondary suite that they live in, but they also live in the main part of their home. So that's
they
not
may not
allowed.
be renting the secondary suite out. Somebody in their family is using it. I assume that's what she means. But can you legally short-term rental it on occasion?
If you don't live in the secondary suite as your principal residence and you live upstairs, then no, you can't do the short-term rent. You can't live in both suites. If there's a grandparent or a child that lives independently in this secondary unit, that person could obtain a license and do short-term rentals. But they couldn't do it if they were kind of sometimes staying in this basement suite and sometimes residing upstairs. They have to have one as their principal residence.
Okay, you get a license for Granny then.
Or Granny needs to get her own license and not not just kind of put a name to it, but truly want to short-term rent the suite as well.
Okay, interesting. Okay, so kind of relating to the bedroom question, this is Juvie. With STR, how many rooms are allowed to rent in the principal house?
So as long as they're all, again, legal and they're complying with city bylaws and regulations, you can rent all the rooms in the residence, but you can only have one booking at a time. So you couldn't have sort of 4 different independent parties be coming to stay, sort of like two on the top floor and 2 on the main floor, and they don't know each other. The whole house can only be rented by one individual party at a time. So concurrent bookings is not allowed with our bylaws.
Okay, but they can rent as many rooms as they want, as long as it's only one part.
Yeah, as long as all the rooms are legal and safe and everything like that, they can rent out the whole house, whether there's 10 rooms or 2 rooms. Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. So Nicole is asking a question again about licensing. I currently hold a trading license. So that's the normal realtor residential or commercial license for buying and selling. But I want to help my clients to run their STR business. Do I need a property management license?
Yes. So if I don't know if Nicole's speaking for herself, but or sort of a scenario in general, but yes, that person, if they are helping their clients and multiple clients certainly as well, they do need a property management license through the City of Vancouver to do that.
Right. I think your question, I suspect, has to do with the real estate council. That's my suspicion here. And there's always issues of crossover between people who have property management license and people who have a trading license. If you
Okay.
are in the property management business, you probably need a property management license from the council. Okay, certainly from your point of view, if you're doing property management work, you need a business license from the city. I suspect because she mentions the trading license. If she does it on a regular basis, she would probably need a license from the council. But certainly from your perspective, if she's doing property management work, she needs a business license from the city. Yeah,
Correct.
Yeah. It depends on how much she does, but we'll talk to the council about that. We'll share that with you, by the way. Yeah, okay. Ali asks, just to double check, even if a strata permits short-term rentals, is it still not allowed unless it's your principal residence?
Correct.
Okay. All right. Stephen. So I believe that at least more than 100 plus property management companies in BC with 1,000 plus property managers need to obtain a license from the City of Vancouver.
So I see the question mark. I mean, property managers, sort of the larger companies and things like that, they're licensed under sort of different things as well. So this is specific in regards to short-term rentals. And I'm not sure if that's what sort of Stephen is indicating there with the larger companies, 100 plus property management companies.
Yeah, rental companies also have business licenses, but it's a different license for regular long-term rentals. That's a different license, a different business license, right? That's correct, isn't it?
Yes.
Property managers, whoever they are.
Yeah, yeah.
If they're managing a property for long-term rental, they also need a business license, but it's a different license than what.
Yes, yeah, correct.
Okay. Chris is asking, couldn't part of one's family live in a laneway home as their principal residence and rent as an STR? For example, in-laws or older children. They could then move into the main house for the summer and rent the laneway as an STR.
So I'll go back. It has to be people's principal residence to do short-term rental. So if the folks in the laneway house are going away or whatever they're doing for any part of the year, they have to live there to get a short-term rental license and make sure that they're adhering to city bylaws.
So I guess part of the question is if they go back and forth between the laneway home and the main home, depending on the time of year, they can only rent out where they're living. Is that correct?
Yeah, that is correct. And I think I'd just encourage people to really think about, like, if do the people really live in the laneway house? I'm not sort of accusing anyone of anything, but are they just saying that they live in the laneway house and they actually live in the main residence? You know, like that's not compliant with our bylaws. And really those laneway houses and the strategy of supporting them from the City of Vancouver was to increase the long-term rental stock within Vancouver. So we really need to make sure that that is being adhered to.
But a tenant in a laneway home can STR the laneway home with the permission of the owner.
Yes, correct.
Okay. Okay. Chong Kim Yam. I am confused. I am a regular property manager under the Real Estate Council. If my client wants me to manage his principal residence dwelling in Vancouver for STR, do I need to apply an additional short-term rental property manager business license in Vancouver? Yes.
Yes. And so it's called the property manager's license for the one in Vancouver. It's not short-term rental property manager's license, so it is just a property manager's business license. But yes, if he's operating them on behalf of the clients in Vancouver, he does require one.
Yeah, just to clarify, so he needs to already have that property manager business license because he's operating a business in Vancouver, managing long-term rentals. So he needs that city property manager business license regardless. Yeah.
Okay. Armin asks, there are currently many places out of the Lower Mainland for STRs during the pandemic that were being rented out to British Columbians since traveling outside of Canada wasn't recommended. Are you considering all as the principal residence of the owners?
So there,
Yeah. It's an interesting question.
I might be missing some of it. In regards to if folks have been out of the country, and we've had conversations with some of them who were licensed, and they were either visiting family initially or that they left early on in the year and haven't been in Vancouver this entire year because they are overseas, and whether it's their own choice or whatever reason, it's not considered a principal residence still here, so they can't operate. They can't be living in Australia or China or South America, anywhere, and still call it the principal residence here when they haven't lived here this entire year. We are obviously very sensitive to what the pandemic and the considerations around it and what it has created around that, but it really is ensuring that people are living there as well. So I think that answers his question, or their question, sorry.
Yeah, it's complicated. This one seems to have several pieces to it. Anyway,
yeah, and we have had conversations with folks who are out of the country on numerous occasions now, and really trying to help them understand what they can do and making sure that they're aware of their business going on as well. It's really hard to manage who is coming and going from your property when you're from afar and things like that. So it's not as black and white, but truly, if they're not living there throughout the year and they've chosen to be in another country or city, whether it be another province, then it's no longer considered their principal residence. And when they come back to Vancouver, we encourage them to let us know, and we can have that conversation again with them.
I suspect what he was saying was people were leaving the Lower Mainland, the city, renting somebody else's STR outside of the area, not out of the country, just somewhere in rural BC. And what happens to their principal residence of the actual owner? Their house in the city, if it's not being used, it's still their principal residence, though, even if they've chosen to vacation outside of the Lower Mainland. It's still their principal residence, even if it's empty. If it's empty for too long, it starts to attract the empty homes tax, right?
Yeah, absolutely. There is a time frame associated with the empty homes tax. And if they've chosen to maybe isolate, if you said it's sort of in a smaller community, that might be a specific nuance in regards to that situation. And we probably just have to understand it a bit more before we're able to kind of give a black and white answer on it. But yeah.
Let's hope this doesn't continue. That people don't have to escape Vancouver for some reason. That would be nice. Okay, Julie, at some point in the past, the city of Vancouver said you could not rent for more than 180 days. Has this changed then?
In regards to short-term rentals. So again, I'll go back to sort of just thinking about the principal residence, and we have talked to many folks who sort of say right now is not the great example of it, but they're away a lot for travel, or they, as I said, they do have sort of 4 months away on this sabbatical, whether it be work or personal or things like that. So there's no hard and fast rule on numbers for short-term rentals. Instead, we try and understand the specific situations of each person. But the goal is compliance, and it's and for us to understand if they're away for 9 or 10 months of the year, where are they living? Are they living in a different area for that entire time, or are they just away on a one-off basis? So.
Okay, so Selena asks, this is about prorating. I've heard from my clients, they initially applied for an STR license at the end of November, were charged $69, and then found out in late December that they had to reapply for the next year, which was another $99. How can you call that prorated? What basis do you prorate your licenses? Or do you? Yeah,
I'll give Claire a break. I can take this one. Thanks, Claire. so my guess is what happened here, it is prorated. You pay 1/12, I guess, for every month that you plan to operate the business in the calendar year. So in November, you would have paid for November and December. But if it was a brand new license, we also, for all of our business licenses, we have a one-time application fee. So that's my guess on this one, without knowing the details as to why it was $69. It includes the one-time application fee, which I believe is $50 or in that range. I'm sorry, I don't remember the exact decimals on it. And then exactly, and then for the next year, the renewal, as Claire said earlier, the licenses are, all our business licenses are January to December. So the renewal for the following year would have been the full $99 fee.
Okay, without that initial fee.
That's right. It's a one-time, and that's again for we issue over 55,000 business licenses in the city of Vancouver, and all new applicants pay an initial application fee.
Okay. So Cameron asks, it seems there is a lot of concern for the safety of the STR guests, but it doesn't sound like there is much concern for the owner. Encouraging people to bring strangers into their homes and rent a room can be very dangerous versus doing it on a separate property. I'm not sure I understand why this would be what the city encourages.
So the short-term rental program is a permissive policy, and it's up to an individual to really choose whether that it fits their living situation or not. And if they're not feeling safe having people into their home while they're there, you know, I fully understand that. It's not something to say that we're encouraging people to do that, just allowing people to actually have that option if that's something that they desire.
Okay, so we're getting close to our time, 11:30. I'm going to limit the questions now to what we've already got. Don't add any more, please. Terry asks, if you have someone doing a short stay for 30 days, then requires further days to stay due to business or medical concerns, do they have to vacate for a day or two? And then can they come back? What are the rules with and the ways to work through this predicament?
It's a very specific example. Making my brain work. So if someone's doing a short-term stay for 30 days, 30 days is now sort of a long-term stay.
If it might be a few more days than 30 days because something changed and they had to stay a little longer.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think people are going to say, go find another place to live for another day or two and then come back. So it really is probably just a very unique example to work through, and they could certainly call us to see what is permitted or not. But it sounds like it would probably be a one-off, and if they needed to stay a couple extra days, that would be permitted as long as they have a long-term rental license or a short-term rental business license in whatever category that they're operating that specific unit. So
probably they should keep some documentation if it ever becomes an issue. Document what happened so they could prove to you why this stayed longer.
Yeah, and a lot of the time with these platforms, if they're marketing them on Airbnb, VRBO and things, they have the calendars and all those things readily available, and communications and things like that. So yeah, we try and be understanding with all these things and work with folks as well. So
yeah, medical stuff can go on longer than you think sometimes, or you're in staying for someone else in the hospital, and yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so Chris asks, could you please give us your contact info to inquire about any other STR questions?
Absolutely. We can give you the general short-term rental inbox, the email. We have a full team there that they can either answer the questions directly if there's something, or get in contact easily with Matthew, Catherine, and Koji and I as well in regards to it. So I can share that through Cheryl or yourself, Harriet, if that's the easiest way to send that out.
Yeah.
Okay.
This session is recorded, and so we will put out a list, an email to the folks that are here today, and probably publish it in our newsletter so that they can listen to this presentation. We can always add that information into the email itself. If people have further questions that they can contact you directly, we can add that separately into an email. That'll work. Okay, one last question before we go. From Raymond, if someone STRs his entire principal residence continuously during a year, does that automatically violate the principal residence requirement?
So if that person lives there and has someone constantly in a second bedroom, That's absolutely permitted and supported, and as we sort of talked about, sort of where the program originated from. If they don't live there, or they're living somewhere else for the entire year and short-term renting it, then that is not the spirit of the program at all. So I've just kind of asked those different considerations to be looked at.
Okay. Well, that's one way to end it. We thank you so much for your patience and your diligence in answering these questions, working your way through the detail. I'm sure most of those are real examples people clearly have thought about and had a reason to concern about. So thank you so much. To the folks who are online with us, we'd really love to hear your feedback from today's session. So when you log off, you'll get a pop-up link to our event survey, and your feedback is invaluable. So please share your thoughts with us. And thanks for sharing your time with us today, and enjoy the rest of the day. We really appreciate having you here. Thanks a lot.
Thank you all.
Okay.